hear us?
Loud and clear.
Great. Can you give us your names, just so we know who's there?
Hey there, this is Nick from VRE.
Hi, Nick.
Where'd you get that?
Who else is there?
From your off the website now.
It's John Rideout representing FAMPO.
Hi, John.
I'm going to reach it for you.
This is Jeannie Alexander with EPR. We're involved with the Stafford Transportation Master Plan.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Anybody else online?
Hey, Thomas.
Oh, yes. He did email me. Mr. Thomas, can you hear us? Hopefully you can hear us.
Just logged on, so it might still be getting things set up.
Well, welcome, everyone. This is our final stakeholder group meeting of the year, and possibly the final one of this project. We should be finished with the two reports by the end of the year. In the new year, VHB are going to be working on engineering and cost estimates and other things which need to go into applications for the projects that we decide at FAMPO we want to proceed with. If necessary, we can call another stakeholder group and probably do it as an online meeting if and when we need to. But officially, this is the last meeting we've asked you all to come to. So thanks for coming out on Halloween and joining us for our final, possibly stakeholder meeting. We have an attendance register. Becky is ticking them off. Becky, if there's anyone you don't recognize, if you could just pass that around to make sure. I've added Matthew, but I didn't get a time to quickly add your contact details, so sort that out. Just to remind everybody, because we only meet every several months, where we are in the process. You will remember we had the transit report, debated that, we worked through all the FAMPO committees, we got lots of comments and input, got requests from localities and from the policy committee for some changes, edits, and those are being worked on now. You'll get a couple of indications of what those changes are when the presentations happen today. Simultaneous to that, VHB was working on the roadways report, the roadways projects, first analyzing what the problems are in terms of congestion and accessibility, and then identifying solutions that could fix those problems. And today you're going to get a full report and a presentation on that. Just remember, we had a specific time period in mind from now to the year 2050. Right? So the idea is to look at the congestion and accessibility problems that will occur in future. It's not necessarily all the congestion problems that you have right now today. Some of them you have right now today, welcome. Some of them are going to occur over time, and we know about that because we've got this great crystal ball that VDOT gives us access to called the travel demand model, which tries to estimate what the travel demand is going to be in the future, and then the consultant compares the road facility and how much demand there's going to be, and can tell you what the congestion is going to look like in the future based on that travel demand model. It's not a perfect science, but it's fairly good at telling you where the worst problems are going to be, and that's how you identify where the problems are. So we have a time period. We try to look into the future and see where those problems are occurring, and then the consultant tries to develop proposed solutions to those problems, which we then discuss as we're going to today. The TAC is going to discuss it, the policy committee is going to discuss it. We're then going to ask the public as well, as we did with the transit report. We'll ask the public to comment, tell us what they think of these proposals, make some revisions to that, and then the projects that are selected for funding applications will go through to what we're calling an engineering phase, which is just preliminary engineering, cost estimates and all the other documents you need when you're going to submit, say, a small scale application in the next round, or one of the other types of funding. Some of the projects you'll see are quite big, so if FAMPO decides to go with those, it will need more than smart scale funding. So we're aware of that. So that's where we are. Today will be your chance to look at the roadway report, to look at the presentations on the roadway report, make comments, request edits, etc. And then those will go through our process to the committees and to public comment. The public comment we got on the transit report was good. We had, Coley, do you remember how many people completed the survey?
410.
110 people completed the survey on the transit report. And we got some letters. We got one from Rappahannock, sorry, the Friends of Rappahannock from the University of Mary Washington. We got lots of comments on places like Reddit and emails and all that kind of thing, and we compiled that into a report. We're going to do the same thing and that forward. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to tell you about what they've been doing and show you these projects, and then we'll have a discussion. I'm going to hand over to you guys from BHB. Thanks for coming, and please feel free to ask your questions as we go through.
Camera also, or just on audio?
The camera, you'll see there on the Dell screen up on the right, there is a camera. But if you stand that far back, you won't be seen on the camera because it pans across the room here.
Well, you can go ahead and advance. Thanks, everybody, for showing up and appreciate the costumes. Nice festive spirit. Ian gave you pretty much the gist of this first slide, why we're here. You know, bringing together the stakeholders, one last opportunity for the most part, most likely one last opportunity to give us some feedback on the roadway solution we're presenting, the 7 projects that we had identified. If you remember, phase 1 had identified the 13 corridors. Our process was to narrow that down to 7 projects that we believe will have the most impact, not only on those corridors, but regionally, as far as east-west mobility, moving folks east and west through the area. So today we hope to get some feedback. You were all given a chance to take a look at the roadway report. We would appreciate written comments when you get a chance. Of course, now is an opportunity we can share our thoughts and have a conversation about it before we get those written comments, just so everybody's on the same page. We also have a quick update on the transit report, and Drew will mention what those changes were. Those came out of a combination of the policy meeting as well as public feedback. And so we've made some modifications to the transit report, and that will be going final, as Ian mentioned, at the next TAC and policy meetings. In parallel, we will also be sharing this information on the roadway projects with the TAC and policy. So now's the time for us all to get together and get behind these, or revise them as we see fit, so that we go into that series of meetings all together on the same page. So with that, Drew, you want to jump into the roadway project first with the transit update, and then the roadway project?
Sure thing, I'd be happy to do that.
Just one comment as he does that, just remember, we split the bike and ped projects across the 2 reports. So the transit report has got some bicycle and pedestrian improvements. The roadway report also has some bicycle and pedestrian improvements. It's a funny way to do it, but blame me if you don't like it.
So to speak a little bit to how the transit recommendation has evolved, we've talked a little bit about the process piece. We'll show a new recommended alternative that goes from Spotsylvania Town Center, the area around there, to the Fredericksburg VRE station. I think the way to think about where we've gotten with this process is really identifying what's that spine of activity, where's really the core in the heart of Fredericksburg, and therefore in the heart of the region, that allows us to plan a larger system around. And that's really the fundamental concept of what we're now calling the high capacity transit line that's at the heart of the recommendation. So as before, the sort of previous recommendations that we shared with this committee, some of those highlights are hitting the VRE station, going through the core of Fredericksburg, passing the university, diverting to provide front door access to the hospital, and then working through the commercial corridor to the town center area. As that continues to evolve, exactly where to route the endpoint is something to work on. There's a lot of considerations when you're thinking about a bus using roads in a shopping center area, the quality of the roads, the turn radii. But we know we want to capture the sort of mixed use development on the east side there. But this really gives us an opportunity to hit, these major activity centers. We're going to drive ridership. And then as Fredericksburg Go plans out its overall network, we would see that as something that complements, connects across, comes into this network here. And then we're retaining, as a high capacity transit route, we're retaining certain elements of a higher quality transit option. That includes signal priority. So as folks recall, that gives the bus the ability to change the light timings in order to get a little more throughput. And right at this intersection here with Carl D. Silver, actually have a queue jump, a little widening to allow that bus to get to the front of the queue, jump the queue as it were. Not very popular in Britain to jump queues, but very popular among bus rapid transit to try to advance buses through this intersection and make their way through. So that's the update. That's the recommendation that's going to be put forward in the final transit report, consistent with the conversations that we've had over the last few weeks. Are there any questions on this recommendation before we dive into the roadway piece?
The big change is the removal of the section on Route 3.
Correct.
We're no longer having a bus like this high capacity transit on Route 3. There was some opposition to doing that at this stage. So for now, this is the proposed route.
At this stage, have y'all done any feasibility to see or engineering to see what might be feasible for the queue jumps right away and stuff? I know that specific road you're talking about, I drive it almost daily. It is very small.
Yeah, so I think that we would likely be looking at right-of-way impacts in that location. That when we also combine that with the pedestrian and bicycle recommendations along the corridor, there would be a need to think about how to fit everything in the intersection. But in terms of the places where you would get your bang for the buck along this corridor in terms of a queue jump, that's what we've identified as a priority. And that's sort of been our approach to treatments. Where are the places where the type of treatment would yield a benefit? And then ultimately how it's implemented is a policy and a political conversation about, the range of impacts. There's a couple of questions.
Well, just carrying on to like a few comments right there. Left turn lanes from East Parkway are obviously substandard already. They still likely to do in our lanes. I know this was a comment that was already brought up about signal timing along Route 3. I think they're optimized all the time already, and so giving priority to something else along the Route 3 corridor, and that's always a feasibility to do that, but something else is going to suffer that, so that just has to be acknowledged.
So there's nothing on the Route 3 corridor now. Did you mean on?
No, I mean, from the traffic operations standpoint, you can take signal time if you want to do anything else to let a bus jump a queue or to give a priority signal to a bus operation or transit operation. So you're going to take it away from something else on the corridors and then something else, side street, throughput, something suffer, and then that's going to be an issue sometimes because you get a lot of requests at VDOT all the time about that signal time. Just
No, understood, and definitely something we know well. And I would say that again, the one benefit here is we're not talking about a bus every cycle, right? We're talking about a bus 10, 15 minutes. So that means not every cycle is affected, only when the bus is through. But again, this is those would be the next step sort of questions. Here are the places where we think from the bus operation standpoint, mindful of the traffic operations implications, where this is where you would get the benefit. And then you basically would do a traffic analysis throughout the corridor. We might find a place we didn't see here where we could yield some benefit. But based on our experience, these are the places where in terms of runtime and reliability, which makes us different from traditional local transit, you get your largest benefits. Again, ultimate traffic analysis might conclude that the policy equity is off and that the impacts to vehicular, auto traffic is too high. But these are the places where you want to have that conversation.
And that's something you're going to work on in the engineering phase anyway. So
We'll certainly start that conversation.
what I mean is, we're not going to solve it today in the report. We have a final engineering phase for you to examine any of those kinds of things that would come in the preliminary engineering of getting something ready for a funding application.
And even if it might be worth clarifying once again that the proposal is not to put signal priority on the freeway. So we wouldn't be impacting the signal plan free out. It's only on our piece.
Before we go,
Yeah, sure.
we briefed about this, but I forgot. So in addition to queue jump and signal priority, what characterizes high capacity? Are there different kind of vehicles, or are they just more frequently?
Yeah, no, great question. So it would be more, unlike in this region, more sort of traditional bus in terms of a 40, 60 seater. You'd be looking at more frequent, longer span of service. And so therefore it's providing a reliable and frequent option versus something that's on demand, something that's not happening all the time, really serving the sort of full span of activity demand.
So it really gets at what people complain about. It's the bus is great, but it's just not there when I want it, when I need it.
Yeah.
Also, the stations will be somewhat upgraded. So hopefully you'll be able to push your stroller or your shopping cart, heaven forbid, or your wheelchair onto the bus, because you'll have a raised bus stop, not just a pole with a flag, but an actual.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, the question.
Did you look at some different ways to get the bus through the Mary Washington Hospital complex? Seems like going all the way to Hospital Boulevard is maybe an unnecessary diversion. Could you go through maybe Eagle Village and go straight to the hospital and then go through there?
No, that's a good question. We did look at a couple of permutations. I don't think it's the end of the conversation at all. A lot of times our bus operations folks, they'll look at, just sort of in terms of geometry, in terms of the nature of the road, what's going to be, most consistent, most reliable, and also what's going to hold up, because the maintenance regime for that type of road is better for a somewhat heavier vehicle using it more often. So those are the sorts of things we think about when it comes to routing, but it's a very good point, and I think something we can note and confirm, because exactly, we want to try to avoid diversions. Straighter lines are better, but we also want to get the people. So we'll take a look at between this and between that, are there some options
Great,
there?
thank you.
Any other questions on this item? I think we'll
I like that.
The Stafford representatives, both on the TAC and the policy committee, have also suggested a slightly amended bike route to connect downtown Stafford with the VRE station, as Drew mentioned earlier. But we've only just got that kind of Friday-ish, so it's not yet on the screen, but they are working on an updated version of the routing of that bike path.
Yep, and so the other piece of the transit report that folks will see, it will go live for the TAC agenda next Wednesday, are the transit serving bicycle and pedestrian projects where the largest change is at access to through Stafford, and we're glad there seems to be an aligned approach to make that happen, and we'll incorporate them. All right, so on to the roadway report. And speaking of the pedestrian and bicycle pieces, there's also roadway, pedestrian and bicycle projects. They're in the report. Since we went through them predominantly in the last time we got together, and we also had conversations with the pedestrian bicycle committee, we're going to focus on the roadway pieces here. But since we're in the sequence of today and next week, this sort of material in the lead up to policy committee at the end of November, if there is any comment, feedback on the bicycle and pedestrian projects in the roadway report, we're still taking them, obviously. Okay, so a little bit of recap. So the phase 1 study folks were engaged in identified the priority corridors to take a look at in the region. And as we'll talk about more, it's the corridors that had severe levels of congestion. that were the areas of focus. We've identified both severe and extreme as sort of two tiers of when we're looking at corridors that are having challenges. And as Ian mentioned at the beginning, this is based on 2050 analysis. Sometimes there'll be questions about ongoing projects that are already in the model before 2050. And this is really sort of layering on what's in the long range plan, what's planned already, what's assumed, and then what issues remain beyond even incorporating the projects that are in FAMPO's long range plan. Here, for folks who have been in a lot of these meetings, is familiar, but these are the 13 corridors. We'll walk through the projects in each of them. So they'll come back again. One of the corridors we'll talk about, Butler Road. It initially in the phase 1 study identified some congestion. When we dug into the modeling, as I'll talk about more of that process, we identified that the ongoing and planned projects seem to address the challenges on that corridor. So Butler was stopped at that point in terms of this study.
Reference that. When you read the study, that, you know, and the people maybe are not as familiar with it, we're gonna get comments on it. So see this list at Butler Road, and it goes a few pages down to, like, you know, page 11, and Butler Road isn't on there. It's kind of what happened to Butler Road. Kind of
Okay,
thing.
sure.
And I think that needs for explanation of what's going on.
Okay.
I also didn't explain very well when I was talking that there is already a project listed in the constrained long-range plan for Butler Road to widen Butler Road to, I think it's 4 lanes, if I'm not mistaken. And they put that 4-lane improvement in.
I wasn't commenting that it should be taken out or not. I'm just saying if you read it, you don't know, all of a sudden it's gone.
Got it.
Where did it go? And you should have a perfectly good life going, but it just isn't laid out for us.
That's a helpful comment because it's good for us to know because we had it in our head and appreciate that. So diving in then. So in terms of the process, we'll go through analysis, what we saw in terms of projects, what we saw in terms of project prioritization. So we recapped this last time, but just to highlight, what is our process for working through this? So the validation of the model, the Butler Road's a good example, making sure what was done in phase 1 that our modeling team agrees with us, making sure as much of what's in the FAMPO model is accurately represented there as possible. We identify projects based on what we see in terms of those model results. Now, a travel demand model is not perfect. It's based on the volumes. It doesn't do a perfect job or maybe even really a focused job on what happens when traffic operations, when signals, when those sorts of constraints on capacity result in operational difficulties and congestion, as we'll talk about more. But it lets us understand where these regional volumes are causing substantial problems within the transportation system. So we look at these projects based on the modeling. And we also, in the report, as folks may have seen, we analyze the projects in terms of what would be next steps of analysis, what would be some of the constructability, regulatory considerations, what would the costs of the projects be, and then how does that weigh against its actual benefit in terms of the regional network and system, as well as the specific corridors that that project might be falling on. And then, of course, the last part is this engagement. But you had a question.
Yeah, more so a general question in regards to the process of the East-West study and also prioritization. I think Butler Road brings up a good point of what are the projects that are already in the CLRP and already in the model versus the projects that we're now, I guess, so to say, adding with what we're doing here. How do the existing projects prioritize versus these? Are there existing projects in the model that are all of them worse than what we're saying here, or are some of them have better impacts than what we're saying here? I don't have a fix for that issue. But just a comment I wanted to make in regards to the process of, I don't know if that's something we can somehow consider towards the end with prioritization.
Sure. No. So if I can re-ask your question, that basically within the FAMPO model itself, there's a no build of the program, the constrained program, and then there's the already planned program.
No build and build. Yeah.
Right. And so I guess is your question, what in the build is most impactful toward the no build, and how does that benefit relate to any that are good at layering on to the
exactly build? Versus the projects that we have here, how do those correlate to the projects we already have in the build? Because you guys did, I guess, a prioritization of projects, and I'm just wondering, are any of these projects more important than what we already have programmed? Or are the projects we already have programmed more important than these in terms of their regional congestion impact or localized congestion impact?
It's a very good question. And Ian, I think it's probably something to take back in terms of what we might be able to pull from the 2050 process in terms of identifying what can we extract within the results from that process. What were the benefits of X, Y, and Z? I think it's a very good question in terms of overall long-term regional prioritization, but sort of outside of what the gambit of this study was.
Exactly.
Yeah, this study was not meant to rehash projects that are in the CLRP, but just meant to incorporate those into the model run to make sure that we are not building capacity we don't need because it's already taken care of in the CLRP project. So the study wasn't designed to kind of restudy those projects in the CLRP, but I guess model outputs show what those things do. We can look at them. I don't know if it does.
Question. We'll coordinate more on what could be pulled from this, what might need to be a separate conversation. And so when we're talking about congestion, talking about 2050, severe and extreme are the two criteria we use, and it goes into the orange and the dark red. That's severe for arterials, which is generally where we're looking, even though we do have a criterion for collector and local roads, is when the volume to capacity ratio, so how much stuff is moving through, how much capacity we have, gets above 0.89. That's when we get into severe and look at making improvements. Above 1, when the system is over capacity, you're going to see larger queues, more delay, greater challenges in the overall transportation system. But any system, as it approaches capacity, begins to experience some of those challenges as well, which is why we start at 0.89 versus at 1. And so when we look at the future traffic conditions in our corridors, so we have these focus study areas where based on the phase 1 analysis, these were the sort of segments of the corridors that appeared to have the congestion and that were sort of logical within that section of the corridor, as in they didn't just, stop halfway down a major tie-in to another route. And so when we look in those areas, the main metric we're using in this report is average peak VC ratio. It's the same thing used in the phase 1, which is basically within that corridor, the average peak of the volume to capacity ratio. So what's the average intensity of high volume travel? And so you can see in yellow, we highlight some of the places where throughout that segment, we're seeing V over C over 1. In some of these corridors, we may see a smaller segment where V over C rises above 1, but then throughout that segment, we're generally seeing something like above 0.89 levels, so therefore severe levels of congestion in that study area. And some places that's only in one direction. So in 2050 eastbound on Cowan Central Park, for example, we see higher levels of congestion than the west. So this gives us our initial roadmap in terms of where we're looking at. And so overall, some of the key highlights. Where do we see this congestion? Where a lot of auto-oriented retail, commercial mixes in particular with I-95 related activity. That's where some of our biggest challenges are. It's also a place where a lot of the traffic operations story that isn't necessarily captured in this model also happens and influence, overall traffic operations. This is an east-west study, but as we've talked about, the north-south flows end up having a lot of impacts on the east-west operations. So we're trying to balance solutions that do a little for both. And in addition to both what we talk about and in strategies around traditional widening of the corridor itself, thinking about parallel routes, thinking about access management, how to develop a larger grid of streets. Those are all part and parcel. Some of that we'll talk about some options here, but that's also a development review and an overall local policy question too. And throughout this, we'll talk about regional projects. These are ones what we think have a larger benefit on the larger network versus the specific corridor. So we went through a series of projects. I will talk about the ones that we thought rose to the top, so I won't necessarily dwell on this now. But generally, those projects looked at the opportunities for widening on that corridor, the opportunity for parallel or different routes that could help relieve and transition, move some of the congestion in a different way in order to avoid the most congested areas. Look at new access to I-95 and build in the network of roads. I wouldn't quite call it the grid of streets, but build in the road network to create more options for people who are going east, west, and north, south. And so we'll start with the regional projects that I mentioned. Those are the ones that seem to have an influence beyond just the specific corridor. And then we'll look at some of the corridor specific projects. So when we're looking at the recommendations about how I went from that list there to the recommended corridors that we're looking at, main first metric is that congestion impact. But then we're looking at implementation and cost considerations. In the report, we have cost estimates. Those are very high level cost estimates, planning level cost estimates, and they don't have all of the nuts and bolts of ultimate implementation, property, all of design costs, environmental compliance costs, particularly for the larger ones, and then escalation over time, right? If a project happens in 2040 versus 2050 versus 2060, that can have a big influence on cost. And so we'll show both a regional congestion metric. This is throughout the FAMPO area, how do congested conditions change? And then specific corridors. And you'll see the regional projects, tend to have that regional benefit, whereas the corridor projects tend to have pretty minor regional benefits in terms of reducing large-scale congestion in the region, but tend to do well reducing congestion in that corridor. So if you read the report, one project we looked at was a potential new roadway across from north of Garrisonville Road, sort of in Stafford Borough, over 95 to Route 1 to try to see if we could deal with some of the complexity there. Just a lot of stuff in the way to get from there to there. So that's an example of a project from an implementation standpoint was eliminated at this time.
Question.
Yeah.
So it's easy for me to visualize it. Okay, here's a corridor. We got the VCs, and you can compare them. When you start to extrapolate to how does several of these affect the regional, is that a little more art than science at that point, or?
So basically, a travel demand model is what's called a gravity model. And so what it's doing is people want to get to people are generated, and then they want to get to attractors. And in this model, a lot of the attractors are outside of the region, consistent with what we see in this area. People are, going to the Pentagon, going to Quantico. And so as you add nodes and routes and more capacity, basically the traffic follows a path of least resistance toward its attractor. So what you'll see is if that change in the network, and we'll talk about how all the projects come together work, if that change in the network overall allows people to take a route that has less congestion, then we see that regional benefit in terms of basically more people are experiencing less congested conditions in where they want to go. It's not necessarily evolving the land use to say, okay, we build this and then X, Y, and Z changes. So that's really how you see it. So it's still the same fundamental thing as we see on the individual corridor, but it does have this sort of overarching assumption that the big picture flow stays the same. And so sometimes what we'll see in this model is even if we make individual changes, particularly toward the north end of the model, and particularly in north-south directions, sometimes we don't see huge benefits in terms of traffic reduction because there's such a strong push demand to the north, and then of course from the north, that you create a new route and then the model fills it up. So there'd be, so we see some of that in terms of isolated north-south segments as we can talk about. Does that help provide a little clarity?
Yeah, thank you.
I'd add one sentence, and that is that difference be seen in a local road which gets a smaller change. The model shows you how the congestion goes down on that road. If it's a bigger project that has wider benefit, you see the changes in the congestion on multiple roads in the region and not just that one part. But sometimes you will see that if you make a change somewhere, it impacts the traffic on Route 3, even though the project is not on Route 3, for example.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I didn't want you to go any further. I wanted you to go back. You had a slide up there that had the east and west volumes in 2050. And something that jumped out as kind of odd was the one at Garrisonville Road there, showing that the eastbound volume is approaching 40,000 and the westbound hasn't reached, 30.
Sure.
And that seems rather odd because of where that is, knowing that there are no alternative routes to access northward because of Marine Corps base, that the implication there is that people are finding a different way home westbound. 10,000 people.
No, I think it means that they're coming home at different times. There's
No,
all,
these are daily volumes, so they're not related to peak hour. Those are daily volumes. 10,000 more people eastbound. And of course, the implication there is if that's factual, you could add a lane just to the eastbound direction and solve the problem. If that's in fact the case, it just seems kind of odd that it could possibly be that big a diverse.
No, I definitely understand that comment. So we'll take a look at what's going on there. And, I think to the question of art and science versus the model, we, understand where the model gets us and what some of the limitations can sometimes be in terms of the model result, but understand that comment and we'll take a look for sure.
Cool.
I had one. If it is valid, they're all going home a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't know where that is. I mean, that's scares us.
Did you want to say?
Get back to what's included in the no bill, we're talking about 2050. So there are other projects already in the constrained long range plan that might provide that alternate route. Right, is the interchange?
Well,
that long range plan already?
Harrison is.
Washington Harrison is already.
But this is Gary's, we're up to
This is
Stafford.
Stafford.
Oh, okay.
There wouldn't be any additional access.
Right, but that, Chris's point is that's our expectation. That something in the model between now and 2050 has shifted that. And that's why we're getting that differential output, but we will check and make sure it's,
Love to know where that is.
yeah.
You mentioned the cost and also cost escalation, so I'm assuming the cost you're showing in here on the slides is based on 2022 costs?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we would expect escalation over time. Okay.
Just to add on to Garrisonville as well, the PM westbound traffic, I believe, is the worst traffic for that section of the AM, PM, westbound, eastbound. So it would make sense that that's when people are finding a different route. I just don't know what other route they'd be using, right? It doesn't make sense. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so we'll flag that, but yes, this is fun with the traffic data that can go on forever. So we'll dive into, we were starting to talk through the recommended regional projects. So these are the ones where we see a larger impact and they have that benefit. And then of course they bring a larger set of costs and policy questions and, impacts in their own right. So the four that we are flagging here are what we're calling a new Western network. So new connections on the west side of I-95, but relatively close to 95, not way out, but close to 95 to try to fill in that road network there. We'll talk about a new crossing of the Rappahannock, as well as a new interchange on the north side of Fredericksburg, and then also the Harrison Road interchange. So that new Western network brought together 3 individual projects that we had been looking at. And that includes a connector from Centerport up to Courthouse. That includes from Enon to Centerport, providing a connection. It's also possible, I know it's been suggested to use Plantation as that sort of connector there. And then a widening of Trustlow. And that has a challenge of the bridge over 95 wouldn't accommodate that widening. So this would definitely be, a sort of longer time horizon in terms of ultimate implementation to that effect. And as I mentioned, our goal in looking at this is to evaluate the regional impacts and then the corridor impacts. When we looked at these individual projects, they didn't necessarily perform all that well individually. It was really sort of the unlocking of a parallel network over here that yielded the benefits and also helped address some other things like the challenges of geometry and the like in this area. So we see basically a 10% reduction in regional congested travel. So that means all users overall, the amount of congestion that we see in the FAMPO region goes down by 10%. We do see some increase in that extremely congested travel. So the really worst of the worst, which as we we're sort of alluding to, because this is sort of helping that north-south movement, the model really pushes vehicles through whatever new access is provided toward the north side. So you do see some challenges there, but we do see some benefits in the specific corridors. You know, not too much in these two. Trustlow, obviously, you're taking a road that's congested, but not as congested and widening, so it sees a big bump. But really, the benefit is the sort of 10% regional reduction. Why don't I go through the 4 regional and then?
This is relevant to me understanding the slide in general.
Okay.
It goes change in regional congestion, it goes down 10%, minus 10%, and then it goes up 2% in extremely congested? That would, okay.
Exactly. So basically, there's this much bad and there's this much really bad. Overall, this much bad goes like this, but the percentage of that that's really bad pops up a little bit.
I stumbled over that when I was reading it.
So I'll go through these 4 and then we can talk about the larger, all of these on the substantive front. So then Rappahannock River crossing, the note here, this alignment is, you know, our 2 closest points that we identified when looking at this. This is not a policy statement about where we think this alignment ought to be, but how we can study that link within a modeling exercise. And so what we see of just the crossing, you'll see that we'll talk about the interchange. Just the crossing itself has a similar regional congestion relief benefit of about 10%. But it also does seem to address some of the more extremely congested travel. We do see, you know, in roadways to the north, some reduction in the overall volume. And I know that was a discussion in a prospective concern, but basically we see people who are trying to get south, you know, cut the corner using this route versus heading above this map, east-west, and then over to 95 or Route 1. We see some good benefits on roads like Warrenton, Fall Hill, which is just on the edge of the congestion metric, so it's able to see some big benefits. Some roads, we'll talk about Route 3 more, don't see a huge change, but you know, basically we see some regional benefits from this connection, but of course it comes with substantial cost, environmental considerations. This would most likely be an environmental impact statement to determine exactly where the appropriate crossing is and to consider the protected areas associated with the river. So this would carry with it a lot of policy considerations in terms of its implementation. And then the Regional Project C, which as I'll show in a moment, we studied together with the crossing. So what we see here is that we do see some benefits, but not a huge regional benefit. Just see a sort of, you know, about a 5% reduction in regional congested travel, not a big impact on the extremely congested elements. And then some modest, but real changes in some of the, you know, east-west routes north and south of here in terms of the congestion they would experience. And then, you know, I think as the map shows well, property tree impacts, the regulatory process associated with approving an interchange access onto I-95, those would all be considerations. And this would be, again, a relatively costly project to implement. Bringing those together, what we see is we see some reduction in congested travel. We see a big reduction in the sort of where the worst situations are. And then we see, you know, again, to the north and to the south, some benefits. We'll talk more about Route 3. But this sort of brings together the different regulatory and cost considerations of the two while having some benefits for that sort of overall regional travel.
Just for clarity, those numbers are if you build both of those projects together.
This is this is both of those modeled as one. And then the last one, and then we'll talk about the regional projects, Harrison Road. Again, I'll note we're just mapping out a full movement interchange here. You would definitely think a little bit more in context sensitive way about design in this area. So this is just from a modeling standpoint, the exact geometry is less important than getting the movements in. And so we see some positive benefits in terms of reducing congested travel. We see some increases in that extreme congestion. I think that same story where a new route, you know, particularly to the north, pushing in on some of the capacity there. This is where we see the best benefits in terms of Route 3 of all the different things that we studied. And we'll talk again, as I keep alluding to, a little bit more about Route 3, but it does get us about 4 or 5% reduction in the congestion we see in the challenged areas of Route 3. And then as an interchange, you know, similar set of regulatory considerations around getting access onto the highway, considering property impacts, adjacent to fit the interchange in. And then, of course, an interchange is going to carry with it, a higher cost than some of the other projects we'll look at. Let me stop there on the regional projects, since those are big ones that raise lots of regional policy questions. Yeah.
If you want to jump back to the regional project A.
Yep.
Just a couple things to take into account. The upper one, Courthouse Road, there's currently a development or project working its way through the planning commission, straight through where that road is. As well as the road in our comp plan goes to Mine Road instead of Austin Ridge, which is, I believe, generally where it's drawn to.
Yeah.
So it kind of curves up and around and up to Mine Road, instead of going straight up to Austin Ridge. I think it's Austin Ridge Drive. So there's a bunch of documents on that, and that's been in our comp plan for a while as well. And then do you guys have cost estimate details for each portion? Like breaking them out instead of saying the 115 to 140, break it out in terms of the north, middle, and south?
Yeah, there's a table in the report that breaks these three out by cost. And yeah, and so basically the widenings carry with them basically or the new or widenings carry a sort of a per lane mile estimate, and then layering in costs associated with the bridge.
I'll see if I can find that. And then as well as, was there any impacts to Centerport Parkway? We're kind of throwing 2 new roads onto it from either side, and I would think that there's certain impacts. It's only a 1-lane road, and it has several million square feet of industrial space being already constructed and currently being constructed in the pipeline. So seems like there would be a lot of impacts with just these roads to Centerport as well. And I think the same thing goes for Enon Road after, well, I guess that would be Enon extended. Yeah. It seems like there'd probably be impacts to that as well with throwing more traffic onto it. I know people out on US 17 farther out west would go to Centerport instead of going down to US 17 for I-95 entrances. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So I think we did, in certain cases, model Centerport, so we can certainly share that. And I think that that's part of why you'll see in the report that some of these projects individually, why they're challenged is you're pushing things onto something without the network. So the whole integration works, but the individual pieces might run into that next.
Yeah, I know Trusla's like 40% when it's by itself, and here it's 26%, and that's of course because of the changes in traffic volume. And then as well as that kind of little corner where Enon, Plantation, and Truslow all work in. It may be more micro simulation, but I'd be interested in seeing if there's anything else with that that could go along with this.
And I think you're right that sort of micro simulation in traffic analysis as a line item of how to manage this.
And
couple hundred.
Yeah, and that may also just be very well the recommendation of the study is that whole section up to Plantation Drive should be looked at further for how can you connect all 3 of these roads together now to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Comment on Truslow Road, and correct me if I'm wrong, FAMPO. I think Truslow widening is in the 2050 color. Is that the portion that? And if it is, it should be in the block.
Right. So look at that, I think, because I know you had flagged a few of the different elements, and I think that it remains the 2-way with certain 2-way left turn or in left turn pockets, but we'll double check that out.
Thanks.
Some of these projects have been around for a number of years. Not new ideas. New interchanges and in between that's been studied just a couple times. This is another good idea.
So part of that answer is that we specifically asked them in the brief at the beginning to have a look at the 2 I-95 interchanges that have been proposed in the past and do an updated modeling exercise to tell us whether what has been done 10 years ago is going to give us the same outputs now in terms of the model. Remember, you've built bridges on the I-95 since that last study was done of I-95 interchanges.
Study.
But there was some time back. So we just asked them to do an analysis of those two interchanges. I'm not speaking now of the bridge over the river, just talking about the two potential interchanges on the I-95, specific of the consultant to look at them again. The river crossing they came up with, that's not part of the original brief.
Right, and the interchange to the 17 has some challenges there. So is that taken into account?
Yeah, so the approach to estimating the cost is based on not only just lane mile, but comparables for when building new interchanges on CD facilities.
And that would take into account modifications of CD. Accommodating new interchange.
It would, yes.
South of Route 3.
Yeah, so in terms of the hairs, so
In terms
We-
of the interchange, Route 3 is at 17.
yeah, so that was in terms of looking at comparables.
Correct.
Yeah.
To add a new interchange, and there would require modifications further.
Yeah, no, we looked at a couple of comparables of similar projects. For example, there was a recent project on I-270 in Montgomery County that had to do a substantial amount of access to make all of that work and to make the CDs continue to work. So that was something we looked at. I will say everything with cost estimates is, something where you look at your best estimate and at this level, right, there's a lot that hasn't been planned or engineered, so I wouldn't be surprised if folks had opinions on, rounding out some of these cost estimates, particularly about the big ones.
And so Harrison Road, the interchange there has been talked about. And so you're assuming that in the comp plan.
That's in the CLRP.
Traffic sort of analysis, that traffic burden of.
Well, so Harrison Road's widening is assumed in FAMPO's constrained long range plan, so we take that for this exercise as a given. And so then I would say that without that, you wouldn't be able to implement this because you would be funneling traffic through a corridor that wouldn't be able to handle it. So the presumption is based on what's in the CLRP. That's sort of our baseline that we build off. I think the larger sort of question that you're getting to is why these projects now that have been around, been in these conversations. I think one of the challenges we face is particularly in the major east-west arterials, and particularly given where the concentration of the land use is, the land use that I think that the region wants to continue to build on, to improve, to make higher quality, that sort of geographic reality is sort of a fundamental operational and management constraint in that you have huge amount of your demand very close to very active regional routes that people want to get through. And so these things pop up because they start to give us an opportunity to think through a larger network here versus funneling stuff through corridors that just fundamentally, because of where stuff is and where we want stuff to be, it's always going to sort of hit that impasse. And we know a lot of that's operational that we don't even totally see within this model. So why is this story back? It's because the fundamental transportation challenge of giving people options so that the traffic can flow like water or like gas, still remains a piece to fill into this region from our perspective.
Two of the corridors we asked you to study are US 17, and I'm talking about the northern US 14, not south, and Route 3. And both of those part of what guys used to call the inverted C, I think. Traffic moves down US 17, down the I-95 and back up Route 3. And so part of the problem there that as you said at the beginning, the east-west movement is connected to the north-south movement. And so with limited north-south movement options, you then have severe congestion arriving on US 17, for example. One of the things that I have two last comments. One of the things that the study has brought home to me is that particularly Stafford County has got significant future challenges coming in terms of congestion on the roadway network. And part of that is because there is not a well-developed grid through the county. If you superimposed a grid on the roads that are there, you'd see, you know, like a guy with missing teeth. There are connections that are missing. And so with those teeth missing, the traffic can't move the way normal traffic would move in a semi-urban area. And that's one of the challenges I think we're seeing in Stafford County in a big way. And with the population growing at 22%, there are 22% more people coming in the next 10 years. Where you put them, where those vehicles going to go, where the bike's going to go, where the bus is going to go. It's a severely constrained network because it's been built over time in what was a rural area. And now it's urbanizing and the network is not coping. I think that's something that I got out of the study. I have one question though, and I could have asked this privately beforehand, but it only struck me now sitting in this meeting. So don't kill me, and you're welcome to answer this question during the week on an email. But the first version of the modeling that you did, which I think was done around about the time you presented last to this committee, showed a greater regional benefit from the northern of the two interchanges, and now it's switched. So the southern one now seems to be showing on Harrison Road a higher benefit. Do you know why that is? It's usually because when you recode the model run, some elements have changed, and then it gives you a slight, like how long down a particular road you're measuring, or whatever the case is, it gives you a slightly different output. And I know that it's switched. The first rendering showed us that the northern one gave the best benefit to regional traffic. Now it's showing Harrison Road giving up. Basically, Harrison Road's benefit has increased this model run compared to the first model run, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah, so I think that's something we can take back more to use the out that you provided. But one of the principal things, this model is 2015. And so as we were updating and validating, I think sometimes we incorporated meaningful segments where, you know, okay, we looked back on the 2050 CLRP and making that modification to confirm we really had that correct no build for this exercise was accurate. I think that was the principal source of why a few corridors shifted.
If you want to jump back to just a B.
Sure thing.
Several questions on this. In terms of what is already coded in the model for the, I guess, 2015 or 2019 model runs versus 2050, I'd be interested in seeing how the existing CD lanes that have partially been built and are already under construction for southbound and northbound river crossing projects, how those impact this area in the same context for the regional congestion travel and the extreme congestion travel. You know, I think this is one option, but I think that was the chosen option for how to fix this issue several years ago. That's kind of was the given of build 2 new bridges there instead of building bridges in an area where you would then hurt the environment out there.
So those model runs, to answer that, first of all, they're not part of the study. They're not part of the scope of the study, but PDOT has already done that when they built bridges. They did model run to determine what the impact would be. So we'd ask PDOT for those.
It'd be a different type of data than what's in here. And I guess you guys probably ran a build or no build model in 2019 to compare values to, because that's where you're getting the minus 10%.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, so we have our no build, we have a 2035 and a 2050. Our no build is the FAMPO build scenario for those years.
Right.
So
you didn't run anything for 2019.
Just to we did some calibration using that. That's it, I believe.
Okay. Then as well as I assume the minus 10% for Warrenton Road and the plus 1% for Route 3, all the people in Warrenton Road are going to Central Park. That'd be something of interest to also understand in terms of just the origin destination patterns of travel for that.
Yeah, we can see what we can decompose there. It isn't
I don't know if I don't know if the model outputs that data. I know it does output some OD travel flows. I don't know if that is something that you guys could put out. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at them.
We can pull some of the AADTs
Okay.
that will come out of that to see, okay, so where does it look like traffic is shifting to, which is easier in sort of immediate.
There may be TAZ travel flows. I just don't remember.
Sure.
And then other question, or just more so comments, benefit to cost ratio. You guys have in the main document, you know, I guess congestion score for all of these projects. I don't know if it'd be possible to figure out kind of what's the benefit to the cost. Yeah, the Warrenton Road project you mentioned, it's only 8 to 10 million on this versus this is 300 to 400 million. That benefit to cost is a significant difference there. I know these are just planning level, but anyways, there will be significant difference. So it'd be interested in terms of prioritization of projects to understand the cost to the actual congestion benefit.
Okay.
Where's the terminus in Stafford for the bridge?
To be determined, but basically, you know, the way it was modeled was sort of in the vicinity of Celebrate Virginia Parkway to, you know, Shelton Boulevard here.
Down with the golf course.
Yeah, so this is, right, that's how it was done as a sort of mathematical exercise, sort of draw the shortest A to B, but that's not a recommendation about the alignment.
And then you're bringing it back to 95.
Potentially, this breaks it either as a standalone, in which case it's really about bringing people, you know, into Fredericksburg or down into Route 3, or you're providing that additional interchange to the north.
Essentially, those are two separate projects. The consultant's recommending both of them, but there are two separate projects. It's unlikely they'll be built simultaneously if they are built.
Question.
And this is Nick from VRE. Sorry if I interrupted someone in the room. Am I good to talk?
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but do the traffic counts, especially in the roads leading to the VRE stations, in this model, is it assuming that there's a higher level of VRE service and Amtrak service at the Fredericksburg station in this model, or is this agnostic to any changes to transit frequency and whatever access demand might be induced as part of that?
That's a good question. We'll take that back. It's, you know, should be, you know, overall the vision for 2050 should take into account those, you know, long range growth, transforming rail in Virginia and the like, but I'd need to give you exactly how and how much that might be coded.
Nick,
I
just for
suspect
reference
it's
as well-
probably. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I suspect it's probably not material, just because of the, you know, the large volume of local travel that we're talking about here. But I mean, one of the things that would be helpful in this report too, and I think it was discussed at the last meeting or maybe a meeting before, is even with all the improvements we've done to the 95, the existing 95 crossing over the Rappahannock, it's still going to be a failing facility by 2050. And so I think that just further exemplifies the need for not only these improvements, like these regional improvements, but also additional transit improvements, which would be included in the other report. So.
Nick, this is Matthew Lehane. I'll just also reference the model does not, in terms of transit and how it takes into account, it is a very, very, very tiny factor in terms of the total model output. So roadways versus transit, roadways are a vast majority of all the data that gets taken into account when it's completing the modeling. So there is data for transit, but it doesn't do much with it.
Yeah, no, I that's what I figured. I'm just, you know, thinking about, let's say, take a station like Brook. If we're projecting double the number of trains by 2050, that's probably more than double the number of people accessing that station, which on those existing roads could have a pretty demonstrable impact. So I just want to make sure that those little kind of more nuanced traffic or trip generators are being included, because they have a significant impact on those smaller one-lane road or two-lane roads, you know, around Leland, Brook, and even around Spotsylvania Station too.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about one of those examples where we do recommend a little bit of improvements in order to, in part, to improve access to a VRE station. So that's a good flag there. Steven.
I had a question about number D, please. Was that, I just wanted to, and it was good that Matthew kind of opened this book. I think the cost on this one, you probably, I don't know, maybe you've thought about it, need to include extension of the CD system to that interchange. Well, I really don't know that we'll see any interchanges in this area that do not, new interchanges that don't connect to.
Right.
Now, the one up at the rest area, there's already going to be CD system there to tie into.
Right.
So, but this one would probably have to have that extension in all likelihood. I think you should probably back me up on that.
Yeah.
So we should include the
Well,
cost.
Secretary of Transportation doesn't want to give us those lanes. He told us we're going to have flying cars by 2050. So that we can't keep screaming for another lane and another lane and another lane. So
If that's the case.
he doesn't want to give us another
change the
lane.
whole direction of this study.
If he doesn't want to give us
To
another
landing
lane.
areas for.
If he doesn't want to give, he said that in a public meeting. You were there actually when he answered that question, and he's like, oh, all you want is another lane on the I-95, and you can't always get another lane on the I-95.
Just
That's
for
what he said.
just for reference as well, the existing fourth lane, that connection with CD, the main line, is probably just north of that white box. So it comes pretty close already.
Yeah, no, we'll check. I would say that the cost estimates are informed by interacting with a CD, but in terms of, assuming the improvements, that's, I think, going to be the jack up the cost.
These CD improvements probably are in 2050 as still being constructed because they weren't built by 2019 when the model was built in the first place. So.
Yeah, so I think we did take a look at that since it's so impactful in the overall system. But in terms of this interplay, that will inform our ultimate cost estimate. Yeah.
Since we're talking about kind of expanding the reach and looking at the CD lanes on this one, I know in the report there's talk of bundling. You have your kind of bundled roads in Stafford. With this particular project, the only other thing I would note is it seems like the recommendation for this is aimed at benefiting Route 3, but also the 208 corridor. And at least from our comprehensive plan standpoint, we have Rolling Wood Drive Extension Road between Courthouse Road and Harrison Road, which that is a vital connection at that point if you're dropping traffic to the Harrison Road corridor, I would believe. I'm just wondering if that was a consideration, if that is something that would be considered part of the bundle as well, would be the connection from Harrison down to Courthouse. I will tell you this, we have, if it doesn't happen through, governmental applications for funding, we are starting to see development interest in that area. That whole big area on the south side of Harrison Road, it's been identified for mixed use development. We are starting to see some developers coming in with proffered construction of that road pieces at a time. Just a consideration.
Yeah.
While we're focused on that one. And then the only other one that for Spotsylvania County standpoint, I'm interested mostly in the Route 3 corridor, obviously. But in terms of the Rappahannock River crossing and the new interchange that we were talking about in earlier slides, I guess I have three things. The first being, if you looked at the river crossing by itself, it's stated that, or estimated that Route 3 impacts would be a positive +1%. Adding the interchange separately was a -2, but together it said +1. I'm wondering why it would go up if a +1 and a -2, I would think it would actually, well, explanation on why that would actually go up and not go down. If I add those two together, it would appear to be a positive.
I can answer that question without even knowing what you're going to say.
Okay.
Because you are creating more opportunities for people to get to the western part of Route 3. So it depends. The big question to them should be, where is the cutoff point that they're measuring that impact on Route 3?
That works.
Because if you measure it on the piece before Bragg Road, it might go down.
Yeah.
But if you're measuring further west from Bragg Road, it's going to go up because you're providing additional ways to get to the western part
Just
of
be
Route 3.
interested in the area of those impacts.
The question,
where
the question
positive,
is
negative.
where they're measuring, that's the question.
Yeah.
Because when you shift that measurement closer to the highway, it'll go down. Further from the highway, it'll go up because you're providing additional options to get to that section of the creek.
Yeah, and that, thank you.
I'm putting you in charge for 2 seconds while I run to the restroom. Don't mess it up while I'm.
The second thing is me putting on my old bike ped advisory committee chair hat, and this happened probably 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm just passing this along for consideration. 2 or 3 years ago, we had a suggestion, I think it might have been through Friends of the Rappahannock. They were looking at the new I-95 bridges, and there was some advocacy considering a new bike ped crossing across the river. That's obviously occurring. Question is if this is an opportunity to pair with a bike ped crossing with that new bridge that's being advocated for, and how would it land and what would it connect into? Just a consideration. I try to pass along things I've heard over the years, and that was from feedback. Yeah. Was it you back in the?
Somebody gave me that idea.
Yeah,
but I was a middle.
I don't forget. But that's the other thing that I had.
Yeah, no, that's definitely mentioned that at one of our previous meetings.
Okay.
Facility over the river would incorporate.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that as a positive of the requirement for an EIS, probably for something like this, is a clear mitigation that would be wise for folks to organize and act. Okay. Unless there's any other questions. Oh, yeah, but
While Ian's in there, as far as the constrained long range plans, and I believe in looking at the earlier, Huxley Road,
I just heard one.
CLRC is shown as road widening state. And I think what the model assumed was that 2 lane was a center turn lane at Twiddle, which they did this model. And then we noticed too that in the constraint plan, Jacob, the Mills Drive, Route 17.
Yeah.
Is only shown in the current CLRP to be lane from Route 1 to Hospital Drive. And so that might be something in a CLRP update.
That is definitely an
Might
update.
have missed that.
The comp plan has it 4 laning.
Yeah, so that's just, I talked to Friday.
Yep.
Next, I think the CLRP just noticed that's a bit of a miss.
Yep.
And I don't see Rolling Wood Drive in the CLRP.
Okay.
Therefore, it would not have been modeled.
Yep.
So, Drew, what Jacob is describing is a parallel from 208 up to here. So that's pretty cool to know that that's going to happen.
So typically when I've been involved with long range transportation, I've been kind of tasked with identifying the bike ped portions of it, but yeah, we'll definitely go with transportation. And when we do an update, those two are, yeah, for sure, because some of those have actually been on our comp plan for many, many years. Yeah, I mean, heck, Rollingwood Extension goes back to, which isn't there, the whole Mole Connector Road. That's no longer there, but yeah,
Looking at the effort that went into this
yeah,
huge effort,
yeah,
it's easy to give something like that. And it's a really good network grid that may really well affect.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the comp plan, and I know the comp plan and long-range transportation plan don't always line up. The Line Road Extended, which is Centerport Extended, depending on how you look at it.
Right.
North and south of the existing interchange up there are in the county's comp plan, but they're not LRTP. So I don't know if, just while that's on the table.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we can do in describing these projects is help bring that synthesis, because it, as I think we saw when the last time we were looking at it, you saw some lines on a black page that weren't very demonstrative. What the model really is, right? There's a series of connections that can be, the fact if it's over, yes, if intersections line up, it has some impact overall on the VC, but overall the flows are what we're trying to understand. So articulating how a suggestion about the Western network can tie into the projects within the different comprehensive plans, even if the exact alignment shown here doesn't square up, the modeling would support, those planned projects, even if they're not in the CLRP.
So this is a stakeholder group, not a formal committee of FAMPO, which means that we have a chance to do this sort of thing. Say, hey, what about this? What about that? Think about this. It helps us to refine this work before it goes to the formal committees for formal votes and decisions. So this is helpful stuff. But I think unless somebody's got an important further comment on these 4 regional projects, I'm going to suggest we move on to the other projects in the interest of time. We've been an hour and 15 minutes at this, and I know you guys, by the time we get close to 2 hours, you want to kill somebody because it's there by PowerPoint. So
There is one thing
I'm the one
I would
closest.
like to mention about that one that's on the screen right now. I believe that is in,
it is.
Yes.
so if it's in there, it's in the model, whatever. Why is it in here? In other words,
What your question, to reframe it, is why did we ask them to look at this again?
something that's already in.
Yeah.
The one, as you're going to speak to it. Yeah.
Because we wanted a comparison between these projects to see whether there should be a priority. Because the city had the other project in the CLRP and then chose to remove it when we did the 2050 update. So the question, and people are still talking about both of these projects, and they're still talking about things like outer connectors and inner connectors and river crossings. So we did not ask them to do the river crossing. They came up with that all on their own. But we did ask them to look at the 2 possible additional access points to the I-95. They came up in our survey last year. Remember the mega survey we did, where we got all those responses? This question came up, and it's been talked about at FAMPO committees ad nauseam. Question is, we put it to them to say, could you do another comparison of these 2 and tell us whether, with current volumes and expected growth updated, what benefit these 2 projects will have, to see whether we've got the priorities right.
But is the assumption on this one then that it isn't built and we're building it and we're seeing what the benefit is, even though it's part of the model?
Yeah. So
Pull it out.
Right. So basically for the interchanges, the way our sort of scope was on this question, delete and add to test that permutation. Otherwise, ceteris paribus, keep things the same, and otherwise incorporate them all. So we can make sure to note and clarify what that means for operations. But it's a good question because it is the one permutation from, the constrained long range plan is, the gospel that we hold to.
All right. So.
All right.
Shall we move on?
Without getting the going. Okay, so now we're going to move to the corridor projects. We see, and this was speaking to some of the places where we maybe like corridor project where we see some regional benefits. Looking at the system turn lanes in this area converting to through lanes, we see some actually pretty good regional benefit. We see some decent corridor benefit, and it's a relatively low cost project.
Just really quickly, did we skip 2 back, Courthouse Road?
Oh, we did. Thank you for.
I was looking at my slide.
I was that clicker. We see in terms of widening to 6 lanes, very much section 95.
Is this one of the regionals?
This is a corridor project.
Yep, sorry.
No worries. So we've got a 5% reduction, and then you can see about 7% reduction in Courthouse Road congestion within the studied area.
Just emphasis on, we now go from 6 lanes to 2 lanes towards Shelton Shop. So I don't know from a traffic perspective if that makes sense. I don't know how the model is taking that into account. It may not be, and that might be microsimulation that needs to be taken care of, but it just doesn't make sense to me.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we note really in one place in the report, but we can be clear on, is there's sort of you get from the modeled outcome of the project to then what's the transportation logic of a project? And I think, yes, to your point, in terms of we don't see, congestion on the far western end of the corridor, even after the widening. But to your point, would there be a logical way to move to that transition based on flows, based on overall staging of how you would implement the project? When we talk about Mills Drive, there's a similar one that ties in that conversation about what's in the comp plan about that corridor on US 17 and what you might build to create a cohesive corridor, even if our model, which we're, holding to.
We failed to make that comment to the Secretary for Transportation on the I-95 corridor. So I guess, important point. Hopefully we can do it a little better in our region.
So Garrisonville Road, this has pretty limited regional impacts to do widening to 8 in this area. It does have pretty strong impacts on the corridor itself. And then this, I think these corridor projects, always when you're talking about widening a corridor, the types of impacts of property impacts, access impacts, and consideration of what a wider road does in terms of business, economic success, as well as pedestrian crossing and timing. Those are the sort of issues that emerge, consistently in the widenings, and then the amount of impact will vary based on the corridor.
This is one of those cases where that speaks to my point earlier, my overall point about the fact that Stafford's road network has got some severe network challenges. And so when you look at this, we're talking now about widening to 8 lanes, which is kind of almost unthinkable, but because the congestion there is severe and you've got to do something about it. What you do about it, well, in this case, it's widen the road. But I remain convinced that the overall network limitations in Stafford produce this kind of a need. If the network as a whole were better developed, you might not have needed to put 8 lanes on this particular road because you've got different alternative ways to get somewhere.
Just a general question about the model. All the new improvements that were being shown today, they're predicated on us building the fiscally constrained plan. Do you know the overall cost of the fiscally constrained?
Billions.
You put it together, tell me.
Billions. Yeah, billions.
Billions.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I would have one follow-up question to this too, though. You guys are showing us reductions in congested travel. This is a very expensive plan. It is predicated on viewing the world as we do right now in terms of automobile travel, widening to 8 lanes. You want to widen Count Boulevard to 6 lanes. How quickly did those numbers revert back to, +2, +4? We're talking about a B billions plus 65 million. What are we buying ourselves with this investment?
Yeah, so I think that goes to one of the sort of overarching questions in foreground or in the background is the relationship of this to building out a network of streets through both subdivision policy as well as through the different projects that are in the comp plans.
But
sorry.
But there on the screen, Garrisonville Road goes down by 15%, the congestion on the corridor. I mean, that's the immediate answer.
Right.
But
his
question
is,
there's nothing even to go to there at this point with 8 lanes. Once you've widened it to 8 lanes, you've pretty much wiped out the commercial corridor along 610. I imagine you see even greater change in congestion because you wiped out most of the attractors for anyone to go to on Garrisonville Road. There's no commercial business in this cost estimate. I mean, I realize it's just high level and just construction costs, but I mean, it's just laughable to see excluding a $60 million project when we're doing a short section. We're looking at $76 million easily. And
this cost estimate excludes land.
Yeah, no, I realize that. I mean, you're probably looking at a $200 million plus project here.
There's a lot of red flags.
So this study forces us, the TAC, the policy committee, to make policy decisions. Because these are the impacts that we're going to see on congestion as of the population growth, the number of increased vehicles, the lack of a grid, the lack of a better transit system, and all those other things. And it's forcing us to look into the future and see what's going to happen. And by doing that, hopefully, we then make better policy choices when it comes to where are we going to spend the money.
I agree, but I mean, all these additional lanes, it's just a Band-Aid. Like, you build more lanes, you get more growth. 10 years later, you're right back to where you started, then without any space for expansion in it. I mean.
Correct.
I don't think this study is being framed that way, Ian. I think what you just told us in this room was this is intended to have a debate over what we're going to invest in. This is not presented that way in the report. I would ask that you all, as for part of the city's comment, that we do frame it that way, do frame it as a policy discussion.
So
these aspects.
So this study aimed to study 13 key corridors, right? Plus transit elements, plus bike and pedestrian elements. We did that on purpose. I'm not saying that the study frames that debate that I'm just talking about. What I'm saying is that the study is forcing us to have that debate.
I
So
think
the
to,
study
I think to,
internally-
this reads as, this is what the experts say you need to do. You spend capital B billions, and then as an add-on, you spend what we think for the infrastructure, 65 million, but we haven't talked about buying all of Alex's shopping centers, so really $50 to $5 million to do this. You're gonna buy neighborhoods in Cowan Boulevard, and you're gonna buy houses along Cowan. You know, it could use a little bit better framing, I think. Because if I read this and I didn't sit in this room, I think, oh, this is the recommendation from the experts. And I think that's how it's being presented.
So this is the recommendation from the experts based on set of conditions, which is study these 13 corridors and tell us A, what's wrong, and B, what we should do to fix these 13 corridors, which they've done.
Do you think these are realistic solutions?
Are you asking me for a personal policy advice?
You are our leader here.
Am I? Well, the policy committee was the leader here. Personally, I think that they're a combination of things that are the solution. So in some of these cases, we're going to have to build a large or 2 or 3 infrastructure projects, because if not, when we get to 2050, it's all going to be gridlocked. However, I would add to that another layer, which says that we have to have a better transit system so that everybody doesn't get on their own into a car and get on the road, because of the population growing at 22% in Stafford and 15% in Spotsylvania and the city. We do not have the transportation network to move those people around in 2050, because this study takes the CLRP list and then says, so even if we build these things, what does the congestion look like? And you saw the red lines on the map. It looks terrible. So what this study is saying to me is, we do not have enough of a plan to take care of the congestion we're going to see by 2050, even with the CLR, which means we need additional effort, which is going to cost additional money. So it's said to me that transportation in this region is underfunded. With our current set of projects, we're going to have severe congestion on a select set of roads in 2050. And we're going to need to make policy decisions which lead to funding decisions to remedy that. We don't want to see complete gridlock by 2050, particularly on these 13 roads, plus the corridors we studied in the transit report. See, it's a...
The thing is though, even if we changed even if we adopted all of these plans, I don't think it's gonna make a meaningful reduction in our congestion, at least not more than very, very temporarily. I mean, if we want real reduction, you know what, forget reduction. If we want to just control the growth of our congestion, that means completely questioning the status quo, which this is not doing at all, right? It's just add a lane here, add another interchange there. You're just accepting that it's just going to be awful. And I mean, maybe it's going to be, but I don't see how this really gives us any kind of inspiration for pushing for change.
So this very discussion is a subset of the nationwide discussion across the United States, and probably the global discussion about the question of how do you deal with congestion. And it's a combination of solutions. One is to review your land use, your zoning, where you put housing, where you put businesses, where you put things. Secondly, to review how you're going to deal as a policy with modes of transportation. We can make, as we've just heard, the congestion continue forever because we're going to expect everybody to buy a car and everybody to get on the road to drive to work and school every day alone in their car. If that's the model, then Andrea is correct. We will never build enough roads to fix the problem, because the 7.5 billion, 8 billion people on the planet, and if every one of them buys a car when they get out of high school or before they get out of high school, in our region, VDOT will never be able to build enough roads to make enough space to have no congestion in the area. So do you see, it's a part of a bigger discussion. We are a subset of that very big discussion. and these are valid points. I don't think there's anything wrong with the study. The study is dealing with a specific set of problems. Well, what it's done now is it's made us say, well, this is a bigger problem because it's not just about fixing these 13 roads, it's about regional congestion. And how do we deal with this bigger question of regional congestion? We have to make policy decisions. Some of the things that we are doing, we cannot continue to do exactly the same for the next 50 years because this shows you what the result is. The result is massive congestion, and you've got to find large amounts of money to fix it.
Can that be a sentence in the report?
To further that, to have the discussion, so let's call all of this pathway A. You're raising a good point about pathway B, and thinking, and I'll get to. So then I would say an interesting discussion here, and maybe at the TAC too, is what is beyond that, beyond the add all the dollars up and go. What is, because, you know, there's a lot in the comprehensive plan that folks in this room and all of the jurisdictions have done to try to rebuild grid, to try to think about things, but there is sort of a pattern of development in all of these jurisdictions that, you know, funnel into these major corridors. And what, if we were to add a paragraph or maybe a section to speak through that pathway B, what's the storyline that beyond dollars here, we can pose that question, but that poses the, you know, fundamental questioning of the status quo in terms of how development proceeds in a way that then facilitates that grid, that thinking about linking cul-de-sacs and the sorts of tough questions you need to do to get yourself that mobility without ending up on all of these arterials, which is then why the model shows, you know, traffic apocalypse in 2050.
This is doing exactly what I think it should do, which is making us face these problems.
I think you asked a good question, and what I think your lead paragraph should be is to tally up the B billions that you're going to stick, that this whole thing is predicated on being built, and then tally up the number for the solution, and then in bold and in red say, by the way, we're only considering a quarter or half of the cost of what these projects are because of the land. I mean, we still have smart scale applications and VDOT's all over us about the land costs, rightly so. And I think that should be the first paragraph in this study. And then to part B, I don't know. I think Andrea's onto something here, and I think Ian, you've said good stuff here too. What do you guys? What do we do? Where do we go now? I don't know that I got an answer to that. Land use.
Well, I don't know from the county's perspective.
As well, I think, you know, to Alex's point and Mike's point, you know, I lived off Callan Boulevard for 3 years. It's not feasible not happening ever. Garrisonville Road, you'd have $100 million right-of-way costs, not feasible ever. I think my emphasis would be, why are those projects still being considered? To the same extent that you already took off that Garrisonville Bridge, if these projects are, from a feasibility standpoint, right-of-way costs are just not possible, I'm not sure it makes sense to be considering them and modeling them as they are here. Kind of when I think of the East-West study, for instance, I see, okay, Garrisonville Road, what are we going to do? Well, this is that option. This is not feasible. So what else can we do? Well, that other Garrisonville Bridge might be more feasible. A road to the south where all that stream is, north of Embry Mill, might be more feasible, bridge to Route 1. But really the recommendation here more so could say, it's not feasible to widen to 8 lanes. You need to look at land use policies along Garrisonville Road. You need to look at transit policies on Garrisonville Road. You need to look at other smaller roadway connections that'll help Garrisonville Road, rather than saying, widening it, here's your solution. There's plenty of more solutions than just widening the roadways that could be modeled or are not possible to be modeled because they're land use considerations. But slide saying those land use considerations, I think, would be important.
And
that's he put that pretty well. That would be my paragraph B, yeah.
That's how I would envision the.
No, that's helpful. And then what?
Just a caveat to that, in just everything that he just said costs billions as well.
It does not. It does not. I disagree.
And I think just to get into, you know, how we got here in terms of study, there's no fault. I think you guys are doing a great job for what you've produced here. What you were asked to do, you were asked to study corridors, and you came up with corridor solutions. Yeah, based on the current design and what you typically build in the current design. You did what you were told. But that was well put, man. I hope this is getting recorded and you can just type it out.
And there are 4 other projects which are not corridors, right? Those are regional corridors where it's actions of different interventions that produce a better result.
And that's more so how I would see it, is things like that, innovative solutions of building those new roadways are probably a lot more feasible than
So
this.
for
We
example-
have
I know,
two of those in
For
Commonwealth.
example, the package of 3 roads that need to be upgraded because there's a regional impact of those 3 upgrades. The bridge over the river, it provides a regional, it's not widening a road, but it is a big infrastructure project, but it has regional impacts, not just on one road, right? So all of those 4 clusters, and those weren't the things that I thought they would come up with, but those are the ones they did come up with, right? I had no idea what they would come up with. On projects that are not road widenings specifically, they are meant to connect areas where they can see there is a network problem. The network isn't working. The roadway network is.
I'll just offer one thought that I have, and this is a policy question, and oftentimes it's gonna be for those who have voting power, and I think there's a cultural, political angle to this as well, and what I'll say to that is, over the last 15 years, I've worked with the county. I cannot tell you how many set aside land interparcel connectors, when it came time for public hearing, where moat mentality came in and it said, no connections to this community. I don't want cut through traffic. I don't want their traffic. I don't want those people driving through my neighborhood that's been here for 20 years now that they're coming in. And interparcel connection after interparcel connection, the traffic distribution network between these major roads has all been seized up, because they've all been closed off and wrapped in open space. So you have projects, and I know SSAR now, at least we're getting singular connections built to the property line, but I cannot tell you how many historically established connections that were supposed to occur have been cut off, and these areas that built around there are effectively seized, leaving the only thing that you can do is the main corridors in between it all. And that's a huge problem in this area. I'm familiar with areas that have more grid connected streets, heck, even the city. There's multiple ways you can get around here with blocks. You don't have that in some of these areas where you have subdivision on subdivision and they have absolutely no connection. They all pour onto one location. That was one of the concerns VDOT raised with us in the Thornburg area. We're seeing a lot of interest after years of planning and nothing happening. Now there's all this interest. The concern was all this development is going to pour onto the Route 1 corridor. And until we start seeing interparcel connections being established, and not just more than one necessary, like multiple directions, so you can start going north, south, east, and west, we're gonna have this problem. It's gonna keep happening and keep happening. And that gets down to community concern, public hearing, how these things are voted up or down. I mean, I see interparcel connections voted out politically. They're just not palpable. So it's a real concern that I'll raise. That's part of the problem as far as I'm concerned.
And so, I mean, to dwell on this larger point for one more moment, and then we can round our way through, because it does sort of follow the pathway A, everything you'll see here. I think that you get to a fundamental question here, which is we can advance in the process of who governs what the final report looks like. It is the policy committee, and I'm interested if this group and then the TAC next week have this concern about the sort of overall direction of what these projects mean, what the storyline is of the alternatives that changes the dynamics on the acceptability of the alternatives. To your point, years and years of taking all of this and trying to connect it and that not happening, that puts us within a certain framework of solutions, as we've been talking about for the last few minutes. If there is an argument that makes this more palatable than that, we would benefit from an understanding of that, because, and we can certainly think through it, but that the challenge being, coming this conversation here, and then if sort of the policy committee has a different perspective on those points, we need to sort of align a singular, planning professional and elected official vision to be able to, outline a report with a singular recommendation for the region.
Just in the interest, 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Transparency and for comparison, we should definitely have all those things like as construction cost estimate.
Sure.
Every slide.
Attack and PC, so they're aware that it's really gonna be twice that or greater.
Put an asterisk on that.
In the year, current.
Costs.
We can definitely clean that up.
All right, these are all very good questions, and I am really glad you had this conversation, and I'm really glad all of you got all worked up about it, because problem is, people like Dave's comp, people like the consultants and myself and staff at FAMPO have got to try and reconcile these very divergent ideas, because we can only recommend one particular project at a time. And if the overall vision collapses, we then have to decide what the vision is. So you'll remember that I've been working through FAMPO, this process of developing a vision for FAMPO with some policy pointers, like, are we trying to promote transit, and why, and how does it affect us? Are we going to pour more money into roadways? Are we going to pour more money into other alternatives? What's the policy? So I started with a vision document to say, well, let's have a discussion before we have to choose which project to fund. What are we trying to do? So that discussion and this discussion are happening simultaneously, and they're connected. Because if your policy is, we can't widen roads to 8 lanes, what's the alternative? And it's no good, as some politicians and some residents do, throwing up their hands and going, well, I can't deal with all of those problems. I'm not going to solve those problems. I'm just going to solve my street or my county or my ward or my little district. The hell with everybody else. They can all go and fall into the sea. For example, I'll give you one example, and it's no fleas on them, because everybody else says the same thing about their own area, right? Everybody protects their turf. But I can tell you now, the people who live in Celebrate Virginia North do not want this bridge to connect to the bottom of their street, right? They do not want us to put this bridge where that line is on that thing. Why? Well, first of all, they're paying whatever that levy is to pay for the cost of constructing Center Parkway North. They're still paying for it because it had to be bonded and all that other stuff to fund the road. And they're paying for the nice wildflowers and the maintenance of the trees. And now you're going to come along and put how many cars going over that bridge an hour? God knows how many cars. See, they don't want it in their backyard. But somebody's going to have a space to put more cars between Stafford and Central Park, right? Where are we going to put those cars? VDOT's keen to tell us that they've solved it already, that it's called 2 new bridges and throughput lanes and bypass lanes and everything else that's already built. While I'm friends with everybody at VDOT, I don't entirely buy that answer, unfortunately, and nor does the public. But I know that you feel strongly that you've done a lot. I agree, you've done a lot. We've achieved a lot. But I think that we're putting all our eggs in the one basket. That's my personal view, is that the I-95 puts all the eggs in one basket. It's a nice big new basket, but it's still one basket. And sooner or later, it's going to fail because there's going to be a snowstorm.
It's very important
There's
to
gonna be
recall that the reason those particular lanes were built where they were built was policy decisions largely that came forth
from the FAMPO policy committee.
Just don't.
I agree with you completely. Anyway, Drew, we're going to be here the whole day.
No worries.
Solve the policy problem while you're trying to show us the work you've already done.
Well, I think in the interest of time and in the larger conversation, as we go into these, some of these small, well, not all smaller, but here's a smaller, this is the approach. The Shelton shop, again, for what we generally see with
Mountain View Road,
are, minimal impact on the regional, some positive impacts on the local corridor congestion. And, Cowan, we've heard the comment, and we need to update, I think, this map moving forward in terms of exactly where our project extent is. But, focusing on, some of the approach into Route 1 in terms of the widening there. And then, we do see the benefit, and I think as folks understand, when you have a severe but not extreme and you widen, you get big increases in overall V over C ratio because you've sort of opened up the capacity in the corridor. Mills Drive, to talk about a project that has some benefits across different modes. So this is US 17 approaching the VRE station.
That's, go ahead. I'm gonna make a comment on this one.
All right, so we see pretty good benefits there. There is, we talked a little bit about what the CLRP assumes in terms of the corridor. But, and then this would tie into one of our pedestrian bicycle projects, and provide some co-benefits there, as well as improving some of the access to the VRT station. Do you have a comment?
So it connects to two of the bike pipe projects, correct? The Benchmark and 17 corridor. And,
Yeah.
and my understanding was kind of that the goal was the connectivity between Germanna Community College and then over to the
Train
VRE
station.
train station. My question is, and I know I heard CLRP, but you had stated what we had was up to Hospital Boulevard only, correct?
As far as the 4 laning.
The 4 lane. So my question is, we show 4 laning here from Massaponax Church to Benchmark.
Yep.
But we have a 2 lane from Massaponax to Hospital Boulevard. Why was that not 4 laned as well? Our comp plan is are we creating a pinch point there? Because you have Route 1 corridor out west, you have Hospital Boulevard out west, we have the Germanna Point Connector Road out west up through the hospital, which effectively creates a parallel road to Route 1 from Lafayette Boulevard all the way down to the hospital. Should we not also kind of extend that to the same reach of the bike ped project?
And I know that comment, I think, was maybe raised at policy committee. And so basically what we've put in the report is, this is the area where the congestion and even post, the modeling says, that overall this area, even with the pinch point, basically operates fine. However, from a coherence standpoint, from a transportation planning standpoint, with any of these, you would look at, the ultimate logical terminus, especially if, basically you're going to get yourself to a 4-lane cross section, building it out at once. So that we flagged that in the report as something to think through what the ultimate recommendation.
But that's up enough for a smart scale application of having a backup study if that particular part of it is not in this.
Yeah.
Jacob, when I looked at the modeling report, Massaponax Church Road, as you know, there's a big feed of traffic with all that land use. So it actually showed
A lot of development that's been too.
congestion here and then congestion here. So what it was saying is, this is really where it's screaming. And then we need to put in the CLRP anyway, the 4 laning back to.
Sorry.
So it legitimately shows this section.
Remember, the point of the study was to find on those 13 corridors where the worst congestion is going to be by 2050, fix it.
Right.
So that's where the worst congestion is going to be, on that corridor, and the suggestion to fix it is what is put on the screen in front of you.
But now it's a bigger point there.
And of course, it's a question of money too. I mean, we can recommend 4 laning that whole thing all the way to the other end, but I mean, then it's a several $100 million project.
I just know our concern, I'm talking with our transportation staff, is what is going on to the west. And we're now seeing industrial parks being proposed, multi-million square feet off Cosner Drive. There's just a lot coming in. There's Alexander's Crossing is thousands of acres, maybe 1,000, 1,200 acres, something like that. It is starting to now develop in phases. So it's just it's a concern.
Yeah, no, and I guess a challenge where we said is we try to be consistent to what the model gives us, so as not to sort of say, well, in this place we did this because why, but we do try to flag what we might consider other policy considerations, that even though the model isn't screaming red there, the logic of the transportation planning, the things that the local communities are noting is coming and changing, would give some consideration to how you would build this in a consistent, coherent way, even if not one where, it says severe congestion in 2050.
We do need to move on.
Yep. So just to, I think, close out quickly, we talked about prioritization. We've had a larger conversation about prioritization within the logic of these projects. For the big things, we bundled them, as some folks have mentioned, into a new Western network, tying together the crossing and the interchange. This sort of more traditional arterial.
More over here, because.
And so, we can have a discussion about what is harder, what is more challenging. But basically, these projects carry with them sort of large impacts and costs when sort of bundled together, but sort of represent some of that filling in of the grid and the network and the connections. When we brought those 5 things together, we modeled what happens all cumulatively. We do receive about, 20% reduction in the congestion and the extreme congestion. And then some of our core corridors, Centerport was one that we talked about earlier, but otherwise hadn't talked about a lot. You can see some of these corridors seeing meaningful reductions, but the ones that aren't on this list are seeing basically, less than 10% reduction along their corridor. So we're seeing some meaningful regional reduction, at least at the time of the law. And then when you look at the arterial widenings, and folks may have comments about whether these are early implementation, but in terms of being a long corridor where there are existing roads versus charting fully new paths, we identified the four arterial widenings that seemed to have the largest both corridor, but then a little bit of regional significance to them in terms of Courthouse, Stafford, Garrisonville, Mills US 17, which has a co-benefit around VRE access, which has some VTrans need associated with it, which may be helpful for applications. And then the Ward and other side of US 17 widening proposal as well, which, as folks have mentioned, is relatively cost effective in its benefit. So then the other projects we've talked about are really sort of lower priorities based on their overall performance. Based on our prioritization, there's a table where we give scores based on how they do on the traffic. And then, so I think that to close some of the considerations to think through here, one big one, is Route 3, which, there's not a project on Route 3 here. There's some things done on the side, and we saw that there's sort of mixed results overall with what happens with Route 3. I think our overall goal, because we know traffic operations are sort of at the heart of what the challenge is, closely spaced intersections, lots of auto-oriented retail happening, and Chris is really the expert on Route 3 here, that there's a need to then take what we ultimately conclude from this study in terms of how roadways movements would shift, to port that back into the Route 3 study to understand, okay, what is the situation there, and then determine what traffic operation strategies can help on that corridor now that, once we have a sense of how the regional network might shift in response to projects or policies that we want to implement coming out of the study.
Those last few slides are an attempt to give a prioritization to those projects, right? Where should we start? Well, that's the attempt to say, this is where you start, and these are more long-term projects and so on.
Quickly, on the last slide, very quick comment. Western Network, Plantation Drive, our comp plan, I think, shows it as 4 lanes. So Plantation Drive from Truslow to US 17. So just emphasis on that. I'm not sure if that's in the CLIP or not, but might be something worthwhile to check. Because I think that'd be the overall goal of that road, is it would connect to Plantation Drive, provide that connection to US 17.
Got it. So then I think, in terms of the next steps here, so we're in a period where we have this meeting next Monday as the TAC, where we're presenting this basically same content. So that's sort of a period of receiving the feedback to inform the end of the month we're going to policy committee, so right after Thanksgiving. And then alongside that, we have the final transit report, which is going to TAC next week. And then going to policy committee for approval. So we're in a period right now, particularly on the roadway, of getting the feedback. Here's what you've said already today is very helpful. There are things you want to put in writing and confer with colleagues in terms of what, from a staff perspective, represent some of the key comments in the framing and in the substance. It's very helpful. But basically next week, we'll be presenting similarly to the TAC, on this material and using that to determine what goes before the policy committee at the end.
Thanks, Drew. You asked me earlier for my opinion. So I'd say one thing about the study and then 3 things about policy. First thing is, the study was meant to not say you have to build all of these things now. The study was meant to come up with a prioritized list of where are the crises, where are the more longer term things, and over time we need to address each of the problems, and these are a set of solutions which the jurisdictions then have to discuss and decide whether they want them or not, because that's a decision funding is not made, funding decisions are not made by studies, they're made by politicians, advised by the TAC and yourselves. In terms of what I think should happen, I've told you that I think the region's in for severe congestion in future as a result of what we've seen coming out of the modeling and coming out of the study. And we're going to have to address it in the short, medium, and long term. We are not, with our current pipeline of funding through all the different funding opportunities we have currently, that we are currently using, going to have enough money to fund the number of serious projects we're going to have to tackle to manage congestion. And I don't say solve congestion, I say manage congestion going forward. There isn't enough funding in the system to do it. That's my first point. My solution to that is twofold. The first one is one or two bigger projects are going to have to be built, and we're going to have to use things like build grants, raise grants, a lot of these other federal grants. And secondly, my personal view, we need a regional transportation authority to top that up. The new bridge and tunnel at Norfolk across the bay, massive project, 93% of the funding, we just heard this week, 93% of the funding comes from Hampton Roads Regional Transportation Authority, not from VDOT, not even from the federal government. 93% comes from the Regional Transportation Authority funds, essentially local funds that have been raised through a transportation authority, 93%. So I believe that we, without a regional transportation authority and a number of those very big grants, don't believe we're going to be able to have a long-term solution to congestion in our 3 jurisdictions. I don't believe that's the case. It's my opinion. You asked my opinion because I was deferring to consultants. Second thing is, I think there needs to be more attention paid to mode choice and how we provide modern transit in the urban parts of our region. We can't provide high-frequency transit in the rural areas. But we have to provide high-frequency transit where there's a bus every 15 minutes and the bus is on time and the bus is, you know, relatively focused on getting between point A and point B and not meandering through every little side street. That kind of high-frequency, high-capacity transit, which is why I pushed heavily for the high-capacity transit, we're not calling it, because calling it BRT Light just made everybody nervous. So we're not calling it high-capacity transit. That's why I pushed for it. I'm just trying to get one route up and running so people can test it and see as the pilot. And if it works, we roll out more routes, right down Lafayette Boulevard or wherever else. That's the second solution, I think, is that we have to get that split between modern high-frequency transit and upgrades to the roadway network. That's my third point. First of all, we have a major congestion problem coming and we don't have the funding to solve it. We need to use one of these new alternative sources of funding that we don't currently have, that we're not tapping into. We need to have a split between roadway upgrades and transit, and it's got to be modern high-frequency transit, but only in the urban parts of the region because it's unfundable in the rural parts of the region. You'll then see a bus with 2 people on, and the people paying for it will get angry that they're paying for a bus with 2 people on. But you don't see that if in the urban parts you have high-frequency bus because there'll be people on the bus. So I think there's a range of solutions like that that are the solution for the region. Some of those projects there, we might not be able to put 8 lanes on that particular road. We might eventually have to put 6 there. But that means that you're not going to achieve the full benefit that the consultant has just showed us, which means you've got to have an alternative road. You've got to have an alternative net. What I do like about their proposal, again, this is a personal opinion, the policy committee may completely go the other direction, but I do actually think we've got to find a parallel roadway through Stafford County and that is independent of the I-95. as a local road, not as a highway, not as another 8-lane concrete, megalith, local road. And there are two forms of traffic that two directions of traffic. It's people in the city and Spotsylvania that work in Stafford, but don't get on, and people who live in Stafford and want to come and shop at Central Park or visit their friends in Spotsylvania. And those are the people, those two groups of people are the ones that are shouting at all these public meetings about building a bridge or an outer connector or an inner connector or a whatever the heck they call it this week. Those are the two groups of people. And those groups of people don't see the I-95 as the only solution to the problem. They want another alternative, partly because they just hate the I-95 and partly because they've seen what happens when a crash happens on the I-95, snowstorm happens on the I-95, or everybody from Virginia Beach and Hampton Roads gets on the I-95 on a Sunday afternoon and heads north to get back to Washington and bogs down our whole region because all the roads get bogged down when that northbound traffic comes, or the southbound, when all the trucks from New York, and we've just done this freight study, all the trucks from New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey arrive in our region on the I-95 at about 4 o'clock to 4:30 in the afternoon, when everybody who's working in DC gets in their car and gets on the I-95 and drives home to our region. And those two groups of traffic hit our region at the same time. And John, who may or may still not be online, has just done some work, which we showed at the Freight Summit, on the regional network. And based on OIP statistics and data, we have the worst bottleneck of the road network in the state of Virginia. So the road network bottlenecks here because it's too few options to get through our region, because the road network is underdeveloped. So we have, according to John and according to OIP, the worst number of miles of bottlenecked roadways in the state of Virginia. So that's another reason to build another, replace those missing teeth, right? How we do it, I don't know. Studies like this, it's convincing politicians to invest in certain projects and not other projects. And it's having the discussions with all of you to find out what the best solutions are, because you know the region better than I do. I know the data, but you know your auntie who has to get in her car and drive on that road. And so you can tell me how she experiences it. So that's my personal sense.
So why not include land acquisition in the estimates?
Oh, I forgot one thing, and you've just reminded me. The one thing I forgot is the other policy decision is the land use decision. Where do you put your high density housing and businesses? And that's not FAMPO's purview, but it's the last element that affects this, because if you keep building further out from the core, from the center of gravity of the region, the more difficulty you have with congestion. If you can package people in smaller areas, you can use things like transit and other methods to move lots of people. But if you sprawl them out further and further west and east of our core, and who makes those decisions about land? Planning commissions of Stafford, the city of Fredericksburg, and Spotsylvania County. And those folks who don't necessarily understand transportation planning are making those decisions. And the consequence is what you're seeing up there on the screen. Now I'm done.
To your question, just very specifically, it has to do with what are the elements in this sort of first pass, given how early stage these projects are, do we feel we have a, more reliable versus less reliable estimate, particularly standing where we are as consultants to FAMPO. But we hear the comment about the level, the degree to which property acquisition is served as a cost driver, and we can think about how we can better speak to that and incorporate that. Great, thanks.
I'll say just parting point on the river crossing as well. Traffic southbound is 20% quicker on I-95 from the new southbound bridge. So just that's why my emphasis on river crossing came up. So
stick around. Who was it here who just said that by 2050 it's all going to be blocked again? Somebody here said it. I don't know who it was, wasn't me.
I said it, your friendly VRE advocate.
Ah, there you go. BRE is telling you that it's gonna be eaten up by 2050.
So I'm gonna pretend I'm on the policy committee.
Yes.
Everything has been brought to me. You said, approve this. What does approve this study? I approve that these are the priorities, and I approve of all the projects that are on it, because somebody's gonna say, not through my neighborhood, or somebody say, you know, spending that much money on that doesn't mean, is it, you know what I mean? Are we gonna be able to get approval out of PC if it has all these different priorities and?
So there are only 2 projects in this particular report that are new, right? 2 roadways, 1 roadway and 1 bridge. The rest of it is widening or.
But widening to the point where you're buying half of, you know, Harrisonville Road, which we talked about. I mean, it's.
Correct. So.
I don't understand how I would vote on that if it was presented to me as I've seen it. Based on the great discussion you got, this is brilliant. I don't know.
So typically we ask the policy committee to adopt the report as a whole, right? To give us amendments. If we don't like these things, please go change them, which we've done with the transit report. It's coming back and I should say don't know if they will, but I'm hoping. And the same we're going to do here. We're going to present it to them. This is what the study shows us. This is what's going to happen. Please, can we put this out for public comment? Then we're going to put it out for public comment. Hopefully you guys are all going to make comments. The public will comment and the policy committee members will look at that and will say, we don't like this. Can you change that thing? Or how is this going to work in practice? And we have that discussion with them. We will then modify this report and follow the process and bring it back. So what they're doing is adopting the report eventually as a whole, but with some modifications that we weren't known until we.
Okay, so the initial approval is just to be able to put this out for
comment. That's what we're asking them to vote on initially is, can you vote that we can send this out for public comment, including yourselves commenting and the TAC and VDOT and the public. The revised report will then ask them to vote on. And remember with these planning studies, the reason we have this final little phase is to say, which one of these do you want to actually implement soon so that the consultant can take that small subset and prepare the packs for things like SmartScope. So not all of those projects will they in this study prepare for a funding application. Some of them may be too long term. Some of them may be not needed in the first 10 years. Some of them may be big and we need further study. For example, that bridge, I'll give you an example, or those 2 interchanges. This study is not funded to the capacity where they can do a full engineering study of those 3 big projects. That's not the purpose of this study. The purpose of this study is to show that those are needed or not needed and what the cost will be of doing it so that before we go to do that engineering study, the people like the policy committee and the TAC can consciously make a decision as to whether that's a path worth going down or not. Because if they decide not, there's no point doing engineering on those very big ones. The engineering we're talking about here is a preliminary engineering on specific projects that can be taken to funding applications that are not these colossal mega projects, because those may need a separate study. Good. I just want to thank you all. This is your last meeting today, and you've all spent hours and hours of your life engaging with the problems of our region and east and western mobility through our region. And quite frankly, not one of us is going to like every single one of the projects in the study, including myself, right? There are 1 or 2 that I think are. However, we have stared the dragon in the face. We have looked into the void and seen that there are some problems, and our consultants have been working hours and hours and hours to give us some solutions to those problems. And we're going to refine those, and the ones that we think stand up to muster, we can implement, and the ones we don't, we'll keep them for future discussion, rehashing, future work on the project. I just want to thank all of you, some of you from the universities, the biking community, the environmental community came, VDOT, we had people from the Chamber of Commerce, people from the FRA came, plus all the jurisdictions. I just want to thank you all for spending hours of your life doing this. we do appreciate the input. And as you will see with the Chancellor's report, the comments and the input we've got from this stakeholder group and our FAMPO committees have brought significant changes to these projects to refine them. So we do take it seriously when you make comments and we change the projects. So please keep on doing that until we finish this process. And the public comment period for this report, we're hoping will start at the policy committee meeting in several weeks from now. And so end of November, beginning of December will be the public comment period. And then December, January, February, the consultants will be picking that smaller subset of projects that we actually want to move forward with and prepare them for the thing. So thanks very much, everybody. I certainly appreciate all the effort you've all put in. This is the biggest stakeholder group I think FAMPO's ever had. Although not everybody's here today, this is quite a big group. And I did that on purpose. It wasn't an accident. I wanted some of the community members to buy into this because the more people that understand the problem, more people that stare at the dragon in the face and see how this works, the more informed we can be, right, as a community. And when the policy committee comes to do this, there are other voices saying, hey, not this, or yes, this, so that we build consensus over time. And I hope the Chamber and the FRA also participate in that process.